All right, so today we're going to talk about civil rights for a while. This will lead into your Socratic seminars that you're going to be doing on Monday. So let's just jump right into it. How do we define the term civil rights? Um, Civil rights has to do with equality as opposed to civil liberties, which have to do with the protections in the Bill of Rights. So obviously, the civil rights movement was a movement for equality. Um, and where are civil rights protected? Well, in the original Constitution, there's not a whole lot. Largely, civil rights were left to the states, and of course, we see how that went. As we proceed, though, 14th Amendment obviously is very important in terms of civil rights. There are two big places in the 14th Amendment where we start to see civil rights um, embedded into the document. The first is in the Equal Protection Clause, which states that laws must apply equally. And then second in the Due Process Clause, which says that we are all guaranteed liberty. It doesn't say based on gender or race or anything like that. Um, and the idea is that liberty cannot be allowed for one group but denied to another. And of course, we know that the court has established levels of scrutiny to determine how to judge laws that discriminate, to try to determine if those laws are constitutional or not. Um, Additionally, today, states are important places where civil rights are protected. Most states have a lot of anti discrimination legislation. So, for example, in California, we have something called the UNRRA Civil Rights Act, passed in 1959. It's named after its author, Jesse Unruh, that protects people from discrimination based on race, gender, religion, disability, and other factors. And in a lot of states, like California, protections that we have within the states go above and beyond what's protected by the federal government. But federal legislation obviously is also very important in terms of civil rights. Most important among all of the civil rights laws would be the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Um, and in both of these cases, we see the Commerce Clause, the Equal Protection Clause, and Due Process Clause at work. Additionally, a couple of other important things. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, is a very important civil rights legislation for people with disabilities. Title IX of the Education Amendments of 1972. But ultimately, there are still a lot of holes in civil rights legislation out there around the country. So at this point, we're just going to walk through a few different groups. We're going to start with civil rights for African Americans, and then move on and talk about women and gays and lesbians. Obviously, there are a lot of other groups that we could include if we had time, but unfortunately, we kind of have to pick and choose. So we'll just kind of walk through a lot of history that we already know, and we'll do this kind of quickly and then get to the more modern stuff kind of as quickly as we can. So obviously, if we're talking about civil rights, the institution of slavery is about as antithetical to civil rights as you can get. Slavery lasted for about 250 years. And remarkably, that's 100 years longer than slavery has been illegal in the United States. So we have been a country of slavery, or at least a location of slavery, longer than we have been a place without it. But of course, that ends with emancipation and the 13th Amendment and attempts by Congress at legislation to protect civil rights. For example, the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which basically became the 14th Amendment, and then the 1875 Civil Rights Act, which the court basically undid, saying that the federal government could not prohibit discrimination by private individuals. We talked about that in Unit 3. It said that the 14th Amendment only applied to states and not to businesses or individuals. And then, of course, we have the end of Reconstruction and basically the return to subjugation, to heavy subjugation for the African American population. And it's all capped with Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896. Really cementing the legacy of legal segregation. Up until that point, obviously, there were a lot of segregation laws, but the fact that the Supreme Court in 1896 ruled on it gave those an extra boost of legitimacy that they didn't quite have before, and really carried that era of segregation into the 20th century. In the early 20th century, we have a couple of approaches to civil rights. The two fellows pictured here had very different approaches. So the guy on the left is Booker T. Washington, who, by the way, was the first African American to visit the White House. He visited Teddy Roosevelt on a few occasions. But he promoted the idea of self-help. He said that blacks should not wait for whites to change. Blacks must temporarily accept discrimination and improve the black community through hard work and gaining material wealth, and change would come with time. That was his approach. Help yourselves, lift yourselves up. Don't expect that the other folks out there are going to do anything to help you along the way. The other gentleman pictured here, W.E.B. Du Bois, was definitely took the other approach. He was one of the founders of the NAACP, and he believed that change would come through direct political action. And he advocated education and the idea of the talented 10th, which would be sort of the upper echelon of black society. These leaders would come to lead the black population. They would lead a civil rights movement. So he's really kind of the founder of the African American civil rights movement. And he is also responsible, and his organization is responsible for the court strategy, which basically said that, if laws are going to be made against us, we have this counter-majoritarian branch that is meant to be there. One of its jobs is to protect minorities. So NAACP in the early 20th century became very active in pursuing cases against state and local laws in federal courts because there were more federal protections. And that, of course, culminates with Brown v. Board of Education in 1954. And as we're all familiar with the ruling, but obviously overturning Plessy v. Ferguson. And really, the effect of Brown v. Board of Education, more than anything else, is it gives a spark, gives a jump start to the civil rights movement. This can really be seen as the beginning, in a lot of ways, of the sort of active, in the news, in the media, civil rights movement that we come to see throughout the late 50s and then throughout the 1960s. The effect of Brown v. Board, though, was pretty profound in the South especially. It really had a hardening of sentiments. So for a lot of years in the South, whites had elected pretty moderate, what you would call accommodationists in the South. These were folks that were generally not really big for civil rights legislation, but wanted to help blacks out a little bit and move slowly, very slowly, very, very slowly towards integration. An example of this is a guy named Big Jim Folsom in Alabama. He was the governor of Alabama. And he was very well liked by the black community, and he spoke about the need to pull blacks out of poverty. After Brown v. Board of Education, though, people like him that could be seen as accommodationists were not welcome in government in the South anymore. And he was basically succeeded by George Wallace, who, as if you recall from American history last year, was just an ardent segregationist. He is the one that we have to thank for the quote, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." White Southerners felt under attack, and they responded by electing people who they believed would fully stick to a white segregationist agenda. This is also when we start to see the revival of the KKK in the 1950s and 60s. So Brown v. Board of Education, obviously a very important ruling, but there are definite repercussions in the other direction that sort of solidify the hostility in the Southern white community. Very, very briefly, we're going to just kind of glide through the civil rights movement because I think we all know this pretty well. Starting in the 1950s, we have obviously Rosa Parks and the bus boycott in Montgomery, Alabama. We have Martin Luther King, and a very important aspect is the leadership of church movements. Right, one area that African Americans could continually congregate was in their churches. This made it a safe place to get together, to discuss, to organize, and so forth. So churches are so essential to the civil rights movement. And obviously culminating in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Then we have the court ruling in the Heart of Atlanta Motel v. United States that in fact private discrimination can be undone through the Civil Rights Act of 1964 due to the Commerce Clause. And all of these things, again, really start to realign the country. And we see this happening with Nixon in 1968 with his Southern strategy, where he starts to go after sort of like disaffected Southern Democrats and starts to say, you know, obviously LBJ was not on your side, and starts to woo them over to the Republican Party. So we start to see that shift from the South being staunchly Democratic to becoming staunchly Republican, as it is now. And LBJ was quoted in signing the Civil Rights Act as saying that he thought that he just lost the South for a generation. I think it's actually been a few generations by this point. So seems like that has stuck. Additionally to the sort of standard civil rights movement that is so lauded, we have the outsiders of the civil rights movement. Malcolm X, who's a little bit more in line with the Marcus Garvey, Booker T. Washington approach, the self-help. You know, they're not going to help us, so we need to help ourselves. But in addition, with Malcolm X, you also get the focus on violence if necessary, and we see that especially in another group, the Black Panthers, who basically also promote the idea of helping your own community and protecting your own community, protecting your own people. If the police aren't there to protect you, then why should you respect them, is basically the idea that they were promoting. All right, so we're going to jump more towards the modern civil rights movement, and take a look at Ferguson specifically. And obviously, Ferguson has been in the news a lot over the course of the last year with the killing of Michael Brown, and then riots, and then investigations into the city's practices and policing and so forth. And so, no matter what you think about the killing of Michael Brown, whether it was, you know, a horrible accident, whether it was intentional, whether Darren Wilson should have been indicted, one of the big things that we can take away from it is that it has exposed some very big issues dealing with policing and poverty and education. It's raised some very big questions dealing with concentration of poor minorities in certain places, why minorities are often policed not by other minorities but by large white majorities in the police departments, why there's so little economic opportunity in places like Ferguson. And, you know, I think the sort of civil rights movement that we read about in textbooks is sort of a nice, neat package. We have the Martin Luther King era, we have the March on Washington, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act. It has a nice kind of narrative arc to it. But when you look a lot deeper, you can see that there are a lot of things going on behind the scenes that are less well known. And Ferguson has been pretty important in making those things come to light. So we're going to talk about it. We're going to watch a little video in a little bit too to look at some of those issues. So first off, how did Ferguson become Ferguson? And when we talk about this, I want you to think about Ferguson as sort of an exemplar. It's an example of a town that is poor and you know, highly of a large minority population. But there are towns like that in virtually every state and around a lot of cities. So Ferguson is definitely not alone in the way it became the way it is and policies that are created there. So we're going to walk back quite a ways. Ferguson is a suburb of St. Louis in Missouri. And from about the Civil War to the early 1900s, St. Louis had a small yet somewhat integrated black community. But with the election of Wilson in 1912, who was an ardent segregationist, more federal policies began to move towards segregation. Wilson, for example, resegregated aspects of the White House that had been desegregated under his predecessors. So he's not such a cool dude in that way. The first thing that we really see happening around this time is in Ferguson and St. Louis is something called racial zoning. In 1912, St. Louis Realtors Association put forward a plan to segregate the city. And they put it before the voters of St. Louis, and it passed. This was challenged in the courts, and it was ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court on property owning grounds that you couldn't deny someone the ability to own property in a specific area. So the city was not deterred, though. The City Planning Commission then basically just used zoning laws to create neighborhoods that were out of the reach of blacks. In these zoning laws, and zoning laws are just laws that tell you how a city is laid out, where you can have retail, where you'll have housing, where you can have single-family homes, where you can have apartment buildings, where schools and roads and all those kinds of things are going to be. In this new plan, it never mentioned race. So it was technically in compliance with the court because it wasn't an explicitly racial plan. But if you looked at it, it was a clearly overtly racist plan. The areas zoned for African Americans included a lot of industrial zoning, so they would have to live closer to factories, pollution. They were also zoned for nightclubs and liquor stores where the white communities were not. The black areas were also too small for the black population, so it became overcrowded and slum conditions began to develop. Starting with the New Deal and into the years after World War II, the government started to build housing projects for the poor, but according to federal policy, they could not alter an area's racial makeup, and blacks were not allowed to move to these to white projects, and whites wouldn't live in black housing projects or anything like that. The New Deal was largely successful because, remember, Franklin Roosevelt is a Democrat. The South is highly Democratic. So they're willing to go along with his progressive agenda as long as it does not reach the African American community in the South or promote integration or anything like that. So a lot of important things happen, but they're kept out of the reach of the African American community. Into the 1960s, Ferguson was primarily white, but it bordered on a majority black town. Ferguson had what were called restrictive covenants, and these were things that were attached to your deed when you bought a house that basically said, I am buying this house and I promise that if I sell it at a later date, I will not sell it to a black person. And it was so bad, too, that the residents of Ferguson even blocked the roads between the two towns and would not allow blacks into Ferguson after sundown. They only opened the road in the morning to allow housekeepers and nannies into Ferguson. So we can see some continuation of subjugation there. To go backwards a little bit, in the 1930s, white Ferguson had separated from their black neighbor, forming their own town. Sorry, I kind of put that out of order. But in the black town, which was called Kinloch, they had very high concentrated poverty and poor schools, while Ferguson had the opposite. They had very little poverty and very good schools. But again, the Ferguson did all they could to keep African Americans out, restricted covenants, and so forth. And there were a lot of tools to keep African Americans out. So restrictive covenants were one of those things. The Federal Housing Administration was another. Federal Housing Administration was created during the New Deal to try to make it easier for people to buy houses. It was created in 1934. but they would only guarantee loans for whites. They would not guarantee loans for black people. And the Federal Housing Administration created a color coded system of maps of major cities. And basically, the colors represented if it was green, it was a great area and getting better, also homogeneous based by race. If it was blue, it was also very good. If the map was coded yellow, it was okay, but maybe getting worse and maybe becoming mixed race. And if it was red, it was in the or referred to as an undesirable population, largely African Americans or Latinos or other groups that they didn't necessarily want. And they urged caution to giving loans to people in red and yellow areas, buying houses in red and yellow areas. So this led to some really bad practices. Blacks were largely relegated to these red areas of maps and were not allowed to move to other areas, would not be given loans to move to other areas or anything like that. So this practice was known as redlining, and it's something that was prolific in cities across the nation. You can go and find maps of redlining, even in the Bay Area of Oakland, for example, and you'll notice that the red lines that were drawn by the Federal Housing Administration decades ago still kind of mirror the way the cities look today. Additionally, there was other ways that whites and blacks were kind of kept apart. Were building large segregated public housing projects that kept poor blacks isolated and concentrated away from whites. Additionally, in these poor black areas, there was pretty regularly a lack of services, which would reinforce the ideas that blacks somehow were related to slum conditions, even though those conditions were largely kind of thrust upon them by policy. Eminent domain, which we talked about in Unit 5, was used sometimes, where the city would take property from black homeowners to build parks or something else for public good so they could kind of improve a neighborhood, improve in quotes. And there were even urban renewal plans that pushed blacks out of cities and so on. And through the 1960s and 70s in Ferguson, blacks who wanted the opportunity to try to get into Ferguson, there were a few people, one or two here and there, that made it through, that were able to buy houses in Ferguson, even though it was very difficult. But when that happened, the white residents really started to freak out and saw a changing neighborhood, and people started to abandon cars in this area because they saw it as now kind of like a black area. The power started to go out sporadically, and whites who could afford to just started to move. But we can see that the lack of services was something that basically followed the black population. Services were great when Ferguson was a majority white town, but as it became a majority black town over time, we start to see kind of changes in those services and so forth. And throughout the 1960s and 70s, almost all male African American residents reported being stopped and searched by the police at one point for no reason. In 1974, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals concluded that St. Louis's segregated housing was the result of deliberate discrimination by the real estate industry, as well as all levels of government. And the real takeaway from this is that when we look at segregation as it exists out there in terms of housing, this is not an accident. It's not something that just happened. This was the result of lots of people making lots of decisions based on policies, government policies, business policies within the real estate industry, loaning policies from banks, all these different groups kind of working together to create the segregated society that we basically still have today. If we look at the police and justice system practices in Ferguson, so this is kind of coming more modern. In the wake of the Ferguson riots, the Federal Department of Justice did a major report on policing in Ferguson and just recently released their findings. And they said that there was a pretty rampant unlawful arrest happening where people would be arrested for really no reason. There was no probable cause. As a result of these arrests, people would often lose jobs. And these are people, a lot of people that are sort of on the verge of poverty. So obviously job loss is something that's horrible. The report also determined that people were generally used as a source of revenue for the government. We're going to watch a video on this in just a minute. They reported lots and lots of racist emails from the police force, which is a majority white police force, showing extreme contempt for the people that they were there to protect and serve. Lots and lots of arrest warrants for minor infractions. So you didn't pay your $20 parking ticket and you would have an arrest warrant issued for you, which is pretty excessive. Lots of use of excessive force by the police department. For example, tasers were very regularly used when it was determined that probably no force was needed by the police. And lots of shocking statistics. So again, 8% of the force was, the Ferguson force was black. The rest was basically white. I think it was 70-something% of the population in Ferguson is black. And of all of the incidents of police force used on citizens, 90% of those uses of force were used on black residents of Ferguson. So not so great. So we're going to pause right there and we're going to watch a video from the New York Times following one resident of Ferguson and the troubles that he faced.
Over the past several weeks, we have been meeting with residents, religious and elected leaders, and other members of the community to establish immediate, intermediate, and long-term solutions to the concerns raised by this devastating series of events.
This is Brent McDonald with the New York Times in Ferguson, Missouri.
Because this fight ain't over, it just started.
And you the mayor. I talked to you.
This week, Ferguson City Council met for the first time since the police killing of Michael Brown. Hoping to appease frustrations, it created a police review board and revised court procedures that unfairly burden the community's poor black residents.
You make your money off of our backs. We don't make a lot of money.
Last year, over 20% of Ferguson's budget came from court fines and fees.
So every time you give him a court date and he has a failure to appear, it's more money.
That same year, Ferguson issued more warrants than the town has residents.
Bill 7062 will repeal...
The city did approve a 1-month period to void warrants and stopped fines for failing to appear in court. But even if warrants are lifted, people are still obliged to pay the fees that in some cases have racked into the thousands.
We ask the City Council to provide total amnesty for anyone with outstanding fines and warrants for nonviolent offenses.
My thing is, I got $2,000 worth of misdemeanors warned her. I called Ferguson and asked them, can I come and put $200 2 years ago? And they told me no.
The first thing they do and ask you when you go in for a job interview is very important that you get rid of your warrants because they ain't gonna hire you because they figure you can't get to work. On your way to work, you may be stopped.
Marquise Mull has a lot stacked against him, but he's trying to make it right. He has outstanding warrants in 3 St. Louis municipalities. His $2,000 warrant in Ferguson started with tickets for speeding and driving without insurance. That was over 5 years ago.
It don't make no sense for a person to have to pay $2,093, and I've been trying to pay for 3-4 years. They want you to come in with a certain amount of money. If I can't come in with that certain amount of money, then I'm gonna have a warrant on me. I was getting only a minimum wage at that time.
Now, with a bit more money in his pocket, he's motivated to clear his record, partly so that he can join in regular protests here, without adding to his costs if he's arrested for civil disobedience.
Well, this right here is a voucher where you take it to the court you give them some money and they cancel the warrant out, where you got to come back and get back on the payment docket. And hopefully today, instead of me giving them $100, hopefully they'll take $50 and let me back on. Before I go to the demonstration, I'm gonna go to the municipalities and try to get this other warrants off me before the demonstration. While I'm protesting, I won't have to worry about if I get locked up, which is a big if. And I'm not planning on being locked up. So if a police pull me to the side, I won't have to worry about these warrants. How you doing today?
At least that is his hope. He begins in Pagedale, several miles away, to pay down a warrant there. The police chief threatens to arrest him on the spot.
He's going to be arrested,
He will be?
but since he turned himself in, I might give him some compassion and give him another court date, let him go. So he'll be out in a minute.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Woo! Man, that is what everybody is afraid of when they come and try to get a warrant taken up off of them. They're afraid of being locked up. At this time, I didn't have to pay money down. They showed love to me today. To tell you the totally truth, if you wouldn't been here, I would have been locked up.
Next, Molt calls the city of Wellston.
Good afternoon, Wilson Police Department.
Yes, how you doing today?
Good, how are you?
I'm all right.
He's told he must pay a $100 fee or be arrested and post bond.
The warrant recall, my money wouldn't go nowhere towards the
It was
fine.
nowhere, right.
Okay. We're not going to Wellston.
Why not?
Because I'm gonna have to go ahead and turn myself in, and then make that bond out.
Essentially get arrested.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to get arrested and post bond. So
Then he decided to go back to Ferguson, where he had earlier paid $100 to lift his warrant. He had heard a rumor that the city would reduce payments.
I couldn't pay $50 on it.
Nope, the judge won't let us, allow us to take any less than that,
All right.
all right?
All right.
But he still owed $1,900. He wouldn't know until next month whether he would be able to pay that.
So they gave me another court date up here at Ferguson Mark, getting this money order. They say they got a lot of police cars up there, man.
Mullah's in a hurry to join an afternoon protest to shut down Interstate 70.
Police cars, buses. Think we need to get up there. It's about that time. Up there, that's where the demonstrators, they haven't even got on the highway yet. They won't let us by. They won't let us by. They saying it's for our safety.
Although he ends up on the sidelines of the main protest, with 2 warrants on his record, he manages at least to avoid being arrested.
Now y'all know. This is what the people go through all the time.
All right, so obviously this is not the end of the story. I think that we can, again, really see the consequence of these decisions on housing, on policing, all around us. I think if you just look at the Bay Area in general and you see where people live, there's no real reason that people need to live in such segregated ways, except that this is the system that we have created. I think it's really important to remember that this is a created system. It's not something that just happened randomly. It's not something that was an accident or anything like that. It was definitely a created system where you have poor people in concentrated areas with poorer services generally, closer to industrial facilities, more pollution, all sorts of things like that. And I think one of the big things that we can ask is, have the goals of Brown v. Board of Education been met? And clearly lots has been done to see that we have integration, we have better education, we're working at it all the time. But clearly we haven't succeeded. And there were attempts in the 70s and 80s to try to integrate school systems, to try to take people from poor schools, bring them into wealthier schools, and so forth. But largely people got tired of that. There were big uproars. So, for example, going back to St. Louis area, there were some failing schools in cities like Ferguson. When those schools failed, those kids had to go somewhere. Sometimes they would go to the more wealthy white schools in neighboring towns, and the parents at those schools freaked out. And they put up really, really big protests about having these kids come to their schools, claiming that they would be drug dealers and they would be violent and bring down the conditions of their city. And this is not an unusual thing. And this is despite the fact, and this is an important point, despite the fact that one of the really few things that has been proven to work to end the gap between blacks and whites in education, between poor and rich in education, is integration. Having people go to the same school. It's one of the very few things that has been proven to work, and we don't really do it anymore. And I think that we can even see kind of shades of this if we look at Pleasanton itself. So Pleasanton, in dealing with housing, to kind of go back to that issue, in 1996, Pleasanton voters approved a limitation on the number of homes in the city. What this meant in reality was that Pleasanton would remain a city of largely single-family homes. It put a limit on multi-unit and affordable housing units that could be built. And because of this, the city was sued. Pleasanton was sued a couple years ago by the state and by affordable housing advocates. And it was settled in 2011. And they agreed to zone for affordable housing and build thousands more units to institute a non-discrimination clause in the city's housing laws. And this is, again, just one of those examples, right? It's not that the people of Pleasanton were creating a racist policy on its face, but in their decision to limit the number of housing units that Pleasanton has, they're clearly trying to favor a certain group, people that can afford single-family homes, and try to keep out another group, people that might only be able to live in apartments or maybe even need affordable housing. And so because of this, the city wasn't meeting its mandated affordable housing goals and was sued and had to settle. So this was kind of a big deal in Pleasanton for several years. But why this is important is because it creates a fractured society, so it's not like Pleasanton has no poor people, and it's not like there's no service jobs in Pleasanton, busboys and waiters and nannies and housekeepers and all of those kinds of jobs. It just meant that those people couldn't live in the community that they were working in, and you would have this sort of bifurcated system where poor service workers would have to live somewhere else. Where there was affordable housing, they would have to get transportation to Pleasanton, which, as we know, out in Pleasanton, it's not a super easy thing to do. So they could work in this nice community, but they couldn't live in the community. So zoning is a really big thing, right? The idea of how you create plans for what your city will look like, the kinds of housing that you're going to allow yourselves to have. It really has big effects on what your city is going to look like. I think one of the other really interesting things that happened in Pleasanton recently as well was the new BART line that was completed. I know it's been several years now, but there was kind of an uproar around that. There were a lot of people that believed that creating this new BART line would bring all sorts of thuggery from, Oakland and Hayward and San Leandro to come to the Stone Ridge Mall and do bad things. And that was a pretty common concern a few years ago. So we are definitely not in a situation where we're over these issues. They're still front and center. All right, so now we're going to start to talk about women's rights in terms of civil rights. Obviously, women have faced their own challenges over the course of American history. I think one of the most interesting things that we've discussed is gender discrimination being decided at the intermediate level of scrutiny. and kind of what that means for cities and states and so forth being able to pass laws that discriminate against women. So we're just going to kind of walk through a history of the women's rights movement and talk about a few important milestones along the way. So starting in the 18th and 19th century, remember we talked about this before, but women in the early America, we basically inherited the system of laws pertaining to women from England, which basically said that women had no property rights, that women were always in some way attached to a man, and they would be the ones overlooking this woman's affairs, be it a father or a husband or brother or whoever it was. And that's our origin. But we start moving very quickly to things that we're pretty familiar with, I think. The Seneca Falls Convention in the 1850s, promoting suffrage for women. Additionally, in 1869, Wyoming becomes the first territory. I believe it was still a territory at that time, and then eventually the first state to grant suffrage because Wyoming was a lonely place, and they needed population and they needed women, and they wanted to marry some of those lonely men off, so why not grant the right to vote? 1872, Congress, and this is actually kind of remarkable, Congress required equal pay for equal work for federal employees. 1872. That's a very early move in that direction, considering that we're still dealing with lots of equal pay issues today. Going back to the voting rights issue, in 1874, the Supreme Court ruled in Minor v. Happersett that women did not have the right to vote from the 14th and 15th Amendments, that being a citizen did not confer voting rights, that women were a special class of citizen that did not have the right to vote. So good times there. Coming on to the 20th century, as I think you guys remember from U.S. history, the role of women in World War I was a really transformational one. The fact that women took on roles that they had not been able to take on before, that they proved themselves in industry during the time that men were away. Fighting in the war was something that was a really big boost for women in general, leading to the 19th Amendment in 1920. And with the 19th Amendment came the creation of the League of Women Voters, who were there to educate women about voting, about this new right that they had. Jumping forward a couple decades, 1963, under Lyndon Johnson, the Equal Pay Act became law, so promoting equal pay, that kind of connected to the greater civil rights movement, but promoting equal pay for all people based on, couldn't discriminate based on race or gender or anything like that. And then part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, says that you cannot discriminate based on race or gender in hiring. So if you're going to hire an individual, it can't be because they're a man and you want to have a man in that position generally. 1965 is a very important year for women as well, with Griswold v. Connecticut, which we've talked about on a lot of occasions. Legalizing contraception. It's kind of crazy to think that before 1965, a lot of states had bans on contraception. And I think it's important to think about this historically as well. Why was this so important? In a lot of ways, if we think back to sort of traditional ideas about women in the home and their relationship to their husband, women didn't really have a whole lot of opportunity to not get pregnant. There were a lot of situations where it was expected that, if the man wanted sex, then the wife would need to be there to be there for her husband. And if there was no contraception, then what happened. So women had very little control over their bodies. And even within marriage, they had little control over their bodies. So this was something that was incredibly important. 1972, another very important thing that I think affects a lot of you in a big way, Title IX of the Education Act, I think it was called, made sure that educational organizations receiving federal funds, that they were providing equal access to educational opportunities, and this included sports. So all of your sports teams are thanks to Title IX. So pretty cool. In 1972, additionally, this is the year that the Equal Rights Amendment, which was meant to basically say that any right a man has, a woman has too, that it was passed through Congress and sent to the states for ratification. It very quickly got about, I think, 22 states, but it needed 3/4 of the states, so that's clearly not enough. And there was a 7-year time limit put on this amendment. So it didn't get up to, I think it's 38 states that you need. It didn't get up to it. But since then, the Equal Rights Amendment has been reintroduced at the beginning of every Congress. So it's probably not going to go anywhere, but it's something that's still on people's minds. 1973 was also the year of Roe v. Wade. Again, granting women more control over their bodies. And 1978, employment discrimination against pregnant women was banned. So that's pretty good. Finally, in the 21st century, one of the first things that President Obama did coming into office in 2009 was sign something called the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act. This was in response to a Supreme Court case where this woman, Lilly Ledbetter, she had worked for Goodyear Tires for years, the whole time being paid for the exact same work, substantially less than her male counterparts. And because it's a private company, they didn't have to release what people were making. She had no idea about this for years. When she found out, she sued. But under that 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title VII, it said that if you want to sue for discrimination based on pay, you have to do so within 180 days of the violation. And so it had a very strict statute of limitations. She challenged that. She took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, tough luck, Lilly. You're past the statute of limitations. So Congress passed and the president signed the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, which basically relaxed that statute of limitations and said that you could sue a long time afterwards because, again, a lot of this information is private and people don't know it. And one of the more interesting things that's going on right now in terms of women's rights has to do with the military. There were several women that graduated from the Army Ranger School very recently. And in all branches of the military, they're doing training to try to see about women in combat. This is kind of an open question at the moment, what kind of role women will be able to hold in the military, but it's definitely something that is kind of a new, it's new territory that we haven't explored yet. So you can see that a lot of what women are dealing with is employment. Much of what they're dealing with, what women have dealt with over time, is employment, access to employment, being treated the same in employment. And I think we're at kind of an interesting kind of crossroads in terms of these rights, because we're at a point where more and more women are going to college. More women are going to college today than men, which is a new phenomenon. So it'll be really interesting, I think, to see in the future, in the coming decades, what that means for employment. Does that mean that more women make it into the boardrooms, into the CEO chairs? That's someplace where women are horribly underrepresented. And since more and more women are going to college, are becoming generally kind of better educated than men, what will that look like as we move forward? All right, we're going to conclude this with a discussion of the gay rights movement and the pursuit of equality for gay, lesbian communities. And so we'll first start by talking about the issues. Now, clearly the thing that's been most in the news in the last couple of years has been the issue of marriage equality, culminating with the Supreme Court decision earlier this year. But if you really talk to gay rights activists, that's just one of many issues. And for a lot of people, maybe even not the most important one. The fact is, there are still a lot of places in the United States where now that you could get married on a Monday, and you could be fired from your job on a Tuesday for being gay. There is little protection in a lot of realms for gays and lesbians in terms of employment and some other areas. Additionally, something that has traditionally been a very important aspect of gay and lesbian issue has been access to healthcare. This was especially important in the sort of 1980s and 90s with the AIDS epidemic really being at its height. So we're going to just kind of walk through some milestones of the gay rights movement, both good and bad milestones, starting in 1950. Obviously, there's stuff before that, but we got to kind of start somewhere. So 1950, at the height of the Cold War, or I guess actually early Cold War, the Senate issued a report titled Employment of Homosexuals and Other Sex Perverts in Government. And they distributed it to Congress after the federal government had covertly investigated employees' sexual orientation at the beginning of the Cold War, because somehow, being gay and being communist were the same thing, clearly. The report stated that since homosexuality was a mental illness, that homosexuals were a security risk to the nation, and that people that engage in overt acts of perversion lack the emotional stability of normal persons. Before this, in the years leading up to 1950, more than about 4,500 gay men and women had been discharged from the military, and about 500 people had been fired from their jobs with the government. This purging was known as the Lavender Scare, so kind of like the Red Scare. It was similar in this idea that somehow the federal government was being infiltrated by both communists and gays. So, good job, America. 1953, President Eisenhower signed an executive order 10450 banning homosexuals from working for the federal government or any of its private contractors. Again, citing homosexuals as a security risk. In 1958, to kind of flip to the good side, the Supreme Court ruled in a case called One Incorporated versus Olson that a lesbian, gay, and bisexual magazine called One, the homosexual magazine, could continue to be published and distributed. The suit was filed after the U.S. Postal Service and the FBI declared the magazine obscene material and said that they would not distribute it anymore. So 1958, the Supreme Court ruled on First Amendment grounds that they could write and disseminate their information. In 1962, Illinois became the first state to repeal its anti-sodomy laws, ostensibly decriminalizing homosexuality. Again, the first state to do that in 1962. In 1965, a group of gay rights activists met at Independence Hall in Philadelphia, and they began staging something called a Reminder Day to call attention to the lack of civil rights for lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. And these gatherings would continue for about 5 years in a row on the same day every day for 5 years in a row. In 1969, probably what a lot of people really see as the true beginning of the gay rights movement was the Stonewall riots. And in this event, the patrons of the Stonewall Inn, which was a bar or a club in Greenwich Village in New York, they rioted when police officers attempted to raid this gay bar at about 1 a.m. Since its establishment in 1967, the bar had been frequently raided by the police, trying to clean up the neighborhood to try to get rid of quote-unquote sexual deviants. This time, in 1969, a lot of angry gay youth began to be really aggressive with the police officers in the street, and it led to a 3-day riot, which during which thousands of protesters participated. It received kind of minimal news coverage, but again, it kind of ignited the fire behind the American gay rights movement and is really looked to as an important turning point, I guess you could say. In 1970, then, a year later, there was a day to commemorate the 1-year anniversary of the Stonewall riots, and they had an event in New York City. And after the event, thousands of members of the LGBT community marched through the streets of New York and into Central Park, and this is generally considered to be the first gay pride parade. So 1970 is a anniversary of the Stonewall riots. In 1977, Harvey Milk won a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors and was responsible for introducing gay rights ordinances within the city, protecting gays and lesbians from being fired from their jobs. And he also led a successful campaign against something called Proposition 6, which was an initiative here in California forbidding homosexual teachers. He was assassinated about a year later after being elected. So he became very much a symbol of the movement in that way. Moving on into the 1980s, in 1982, Wisconsin became the first U.S. state to outlaw discrimination based on sexual orientation. And in 1987, in the height of the AIDS epidemic, hundreds of thousands of AIDS activists took part in a national march on Washington to demand that President Reagan address the AIDS crisis. Although AIDS had been around since 1981, it wasn't until 87 or 88, the very tail end of Ronald Reagan's presidency, that he even uttered the word AIDS. So he really ignored the issue altogether until the very end of his presidency. In 1993, the Department of Defense issued a new policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. This was a movement away from barring gays from the military. Some people saw it as a good step, but really what it meant was that if you were gay, you needed to just keep it a secret. If you told that you were gay, or if someone told on you, then you could be dishonorably discharged from the military. So basically it was, you're welcome to be part of the military as long as you don't say anything or act on any of your, what part of what makes you you. And so that was very controversial. So that's under Clinton's presidency. In 1996, the Supreme Court, in a case called Romer v. Evans, they decided that there was an amendment in Colorado passed that basically said that you couldn't grant any special protections to homosexuals. You couldn't give them, protections in civil rights laws or anti-discrimination laws or anything like that. And the Supreme Court said that that law was unconstitutional, and that you could, in fact, protect gays and lesbians through legislation. 1996, President Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act into law. It defined marriage as between a man and a woman and said that no state would be required to recognize a same-sex marriage from another state. This is obviously highly controversial given the full faith and credit clause in the Constitution, which says that contracts from one state need to be recognized in any other state. So in a lot of ways, it was seen from very early on as perhaps being unconstitutional, and of course it was ruled so a couple years ago. In 2000, Vermont became the first state to legalize civil unions, so not marriages, but civil unions between same-sex couples. 2003, we have Lawrence v. Texas, which basically ends anti-sodomy laws and anti-homosexuality laws across the nation. 2004, Massachusetts became the first state to legalize gay marriage, did so through its, I believe it was through its Supreme Court, its state Supreme Court. And in the following years, New Hampshire, Vermont, Connecticut, Iowa, and Washington, D.C. all followed suit. In 2008, we Californians approved Proposition 8. Same day we elected our first black president, we also decided to take rights away from a whole lot of people, given that our Supreme Court had also determined that same-sex marriage should be legal. So Prop 8 passed in 2008. In 2009, again, kind of going back to the fact that it's not all about marriage, Congress passed something called the Matthew Shepard Act, and it was signed into law by President Obama. And this measure expanded the 1969 U.S. federal hate crime law to include crimes motivated by a victim's actual or perceived gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or disability. So basically, turned, if someone went after you and committed violence against you because you were gay or because you were transgender, it turned it into a hate crime, which can be prosecuted with extra penalties. This is named for Matthew Shepard, who was tortured and murdered in Wyoming in 1998 because of his sexual orientation. He was a young man. In 2010, on my wedding day, December 18th, 2010, the U.S. Senate voted 65-31 to repeal Don't Ask, Don't Tell, allowing gays and lesbians to serve openly in the military. And we're 5 years into that experiment, and it seems like our military is doing just fine. The sky hasn't fallen or anything like that. And then, of course, we have the most recent Supreme Court cases dealing with marriage that have taken place in the last couple of years, overturning Prop 8, overturning DOMA, and then most recently this year, legalizing same-sex marriage across the nation. So again, the important thing to remember with the gay rights movement is that there are a lot of issues at hand. A lot of them have to do with just legal protections, right? Being able to make sure that you can go about your life and not be threatened to lose your job, not have a lack of protection if people want to go after you because they're bigoted against your sexuality. And so all of these movements are very important, but I think if you ask anyone within the gay rights movement, they would still say that there's a lot to work on. We've talked a lot about just the private discrimination aspect with same-sex marriage, and that obviously is a big issue, kind of the next big issue that's coming down the pike.